In looking at the Great Depression and comparing the policies that were actually enacted versus macroeconomic schools of thoughts, recommendations for different policies, we next can move to a history of Great Depression policies and look at taxation. Now, at this point in time, it's probably important to answer a question some of you might have. Why are we looking at 4 policies enacted during the Great Depression, and yet we're not looking at increased government spending? What's the deal with that? We know there was increased government spending. That's kind of the story of the Great Depression, especially with FDR. Well, there are plenty of examples of increased spending like this. The average high school history teacher story is one of Hoover not doing anything, but then FDR coming in, to the rescue with lots of different programs. This really isn't a true story by itself, and not every high school history teacher is telling this story. I mean, Hoover nearly doubles the public work expenditures between 1929 and 1931. He's clearly spending some money. Expenditures were ballooning during Hoover and FDR's terms. This is all true. But our macroeconomic policies, including Keynesian fiscal policy, don't ever really say increased government spending is a macro policy by itself. Keynesian fiscal policy advocates say running a deficit is the policy. And yes, we can do that by increasing government spending. But running a deficit only happens with increased government spending if we keep tax revenue constant. Government spending by itself, if it's offset by increased taxation, is not fiscal policy. It is not expansionary fiscal policy. We have to run a deficit. We did not attempt fiscal policy during the Great Depression. Price Fishback's U.S. Monetary and Fiscal Policy in the 1930s paper in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy says, quote, "A nationwide Keynesian fiscal stimulus was never really attempted in the 1930s. During the Hoover presidency, Congress nearly doubled real federal spending and ramped up federal lending through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The Roosevelt Congresses then spent nearly double the Hoover levels. But both administrations collected enough taxes in a variety of new forms to maintain relatively small deficits throughout the period. Relative to a Keynesian deficit target designed to return to full employment, the deficits were minuscule." We can see there was incredibly little deficit spending during the Great Depression in relation to what happened immediately after in World War II. So here are the relatively minuscule deficits of the Great Depression. And here we can see in the 40s, we have much larger deficits during World War II. And this includes FDR's time period. From 1933 to 1937, FDR maintained his belief in a balanced budget, but recognized the need for increased government expenditures to put people back to work. Each year, FDR submitted a budget for general expenditures that anticipated a balanced budget, with a few extensions beyond this, of relief beyond the balanced budget as a humanitarian, quote unquote, emergency spending, to spend the money that people could not in order to support our nation's people in a time of need. Small deficits were emergency extensions only. But then, as the economy started to slowly bounce back, FDR went back to a balanced budget. If we zoom in to just the Great Depression time period here, we can see that there was a small deficit running until FDR's 1937 move to get back to a balanced budget. So here we can see a little bit of a deficit, but then we move back to a balanced budget. We're trying to move back towards a balanced budget in 1937. It should be noted that following the balanced budget move of 1937, the country then lurched into a second wave of the Depression. You can see a parallel in the data leading to the second wave that is sometimes referred to as the Roosevelt recession. So we move back to the balanced budget right around 1937 or so. We're trying to make that move back. And what happens? Well, the economy's unemployment rate, it was going down, down, down. So that's good for the economy. We're getting less and less unemployment. And then all of a sudden we move back to the balanced budget right around 1937. And what happens to unemployment? It raises right back up. So while we did do increased government spending, we did not run deficits. we can see, even as we zoom in, that we have relatively small deficits during the time period of the Great Depression, and even moved to a balanced budget completely once again in 1937, 1938. So how do we pull all that off? Well, we did not keep government revenue constant, right? So yes, we did increase government spending, but we did not keep government revenue constant. So we don't have this fiscal policy approach here. Instead, taxes were raised to balance the budget. Congress approved the tax increase of 1932, and the lowest marginal tax rate rose from 1.125% to 4%, and the top marginal tax rate rose from 25 to 63%. So our policies were not only not Keynesian, but they were against the supply side view, the classical view, and other new classical ideas that suggest the price system needs to operate and higher taxation reduces economic efficiency. These policies are not Keynesian policies either, as we are not doing fiscal policy. We are increasing taxes while simultaneously increasing government spending. Again, there was more than one wave of tax policies. The simple 1932 story is not the end. In 1936 and 1937, right before the second dip in the Depression, Social Security taxes were instituted, and a new tax on undistributed corporate profits was added. FDR is pictured here signing the Social Security Act. But what we can see is that we're raising taxes during this time of economic crisis. We often associate Social Security with just spending, but the spending of Social Security was to come later. The taxes started right away. We're raising the taxes during the time of an economic crisis, and this is the opposite of what some of our macroeconomic schools of thought would recommend, and it's in line with none of them. So that's 3 of our 4 perverse economic policies that were enacted during the Great Depression. Up next will be wage and price manipulation. Click on the video to get to the next lecture in the series.